The cops showed up at my door because I moved boxes. I'm not kidding. My psycho HOA president, Melissa, called 911 on moving boxes. When Officer Carter saw my wife's army patch and whispered, "Wait, is that Ghost Viper?" Both women went dead silent. I had zero clue what that meant, but their faces told me everything had just changed. Turns out my quiet wife has military secrets that terrify our neighbor. This suburban nightmare turns into the wildest justice story ever. Comment if you've dealt with crazy neighbors. You know that feeling when you think you've got life figured out, and then boom, reality slaps you across the face with a wet fish? That's exactly what happened on our moving day. I'm Austin, 34 years old, and up until 3 hours ago, I thought my biggest problem was figuring out where to put our couch in the new living room. Turns out my wife Rachel is some kind of legendary war hero, and our new neighbor is apparently running a federal crime operation. Life comes at you fast, people. Real fast. So there I was, hauling boxes like a responsible husband, when this woman appeared out of nowhere like she materialized from thin air. Melissa King, our HOA president. And let me paint you a picture of this lady. Perfect blonde hair that probably costs more than my monthly salary, makeup applied with surgical precision, and this smile that screams, "I'm about to make your existence miserable." She's got this whole suburban dictator vibe going on, complete with a clipboard and an attitude that suggests she owns the entire neighborhood. Which, knowing what I know now, she probably thought she did. Rachel was carrying work boxes, totally normal cybersecurity stuff for defense contractors. Nothing exciting, just computer files and technical documentation that she needed to review at home over the weekend. But these boxes had official labels that said Northrop Grumman Defense Systems and Contractor Cybersecurity Materials. Standard corporate stuff that you'd see at any tech company. But when Melissa spotted those labels, something incredible happened. Her face went from suburban smugness to absolute terror in about 2 seconds. I'm talking about a full-body panic response. She started pacing frantically on her manicured lawn, making these agitated gestures while staring at our boxes like they contained her deepest secrets. Now, any normal person would walk over and say, "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood. Need any help?" But Melissa? Oh no. Melissa decides to lose her mind completely. She marches up to us and starts this unhinged rant about unauthorized military materials, security protocol violations, and threats to community safety standards. I'm thinking, lady, these are cardboard boxes containing computer files, not nuclear launch codes. But she's going full apocalypse mode, pointing at Rachel's work stuff like it's radioactive waste that's going to contaminate the entire zip code. Rachel just stands there with this supernatural calm, holding a box while her old Army medic patch is clearly visible on her laptop bag. She's trying to explain politely that it's routine cybersecurity work, nothing classified or dangerous, just boring technical documentation. But Melissa's not listening to reason. She's operating on pure panic, and that panic is making her do incredibly stupid things, like what happened next, which still makes me laugh when I think about it. This woman actually calls the police, on moving boxes, on our own property. I'm standing there thinking, she just dialed 911 because we're unloading a truck in our driveway. The audacity was mind-blowing. She tells the dispatcher about suspicious military materials and potential security threats to children. Meanwhile, we're just trying to get our stuff inside before dark. What kind of person weaponizes emergency services against people who are literally just moving into their house? The answer? Someone with federal crimes to hide and everything to lose if the wrong people start asking questions. Officer Carter arrives about 20 minutes later, and immediately, the whole situation changes. This guy's got that perfect cop energy, professional, approachable, clearly experienced with handling neighborhood disputes without making anyone feel attacked. He walks over to us first, probably because we look like the sane parties in this suburban standoff. Carter glances at Rachel's laptop bag, and I watch his eyes focus on that faded military patch attached to the handle. It's just an old Army medic patch from her service days, small, worn, nothing that would catch most people's attention. Then something magical happens that I'll never forget. Carter's entire professional demeanor completely transforms. His standard police officer posture melts into something deeper, more personal, almost spiritual. He's staring at Rachel with this expression that I can't adequately describe. Part shocked recognition, part overwhelming disbelief, part something that looks like he's witnessing a miracle. His voice gets quiet and shaky when he whispers, "Ma'am, it can't be you," like he's just seen someone rise from the dead right in front of him. Rachel hears those words, and her face goes white as paper. She knows exactly what he means, and I'm standing here like a complete idiot with zero understanding of what's happening between them. Melissa hears this mysterious exchange and immediately starts demanding detailed explanations about federal security protocols and government background investigations. But Carter's stopped paying any attention to her complaints. He's focused entirely on Rachel with this look of profound respect that's honestly uncomfortable to witness as an outsider. You know how military people sometimes recognize each other through subtle signs? This was different. This was sacred. This was a man looking at someone who'd done something that changed his life forever. Rachel whispers back, "Helmand Province, March 15, 2016. Carter nods slowly, like she's just confirmed something he's dreamed about for years. The emotion in that moment was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Melissa's getting more agitated by the second, because she obviously doesn't understand what's happening, but she can sense that something important is shifting away from her control. She keeps demanding that Carter investigate Rachel's dangerous military connections and secure the neighborhood from potential federal threats. The woman's clearly panicking about something way bigger than moving boxes, and she's trying desperately to use law enforcement to solve her problem. But Carter's not interested in her paranoid theories anymore. That's when Carter pulls Rachel aside and tells her something that made my knees weak. "Your wife," he says to me with his voice full of emotion, "held my wife Amy when she died in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Amy Carter, Helmand Province, 7 years ago." He looks at Rachel like she's an angel who fell from heaven. "You gave her peace in her final moments when I couldn't be there. You whispered prayers with her so she wouldn't die alone and afraid." The weight of that revelation hit me like a freight train. My wife, my quiet computer-fixing wife who gets nervous ordering pizza over the phone, had been a combat hero who saved lives and comforted dying soldiers. She'd held this man's wife during the worst moment of his life and made it bearable. And Melissa, our self-appointed neighborhood dictator, had just called the cops on someone who had given a police officer's wife her final moments of peace and dignity. Carter whispers to Rachel, "7 years ago, in Helmand Province, you held my wife Amy as she died. But here's what I need to know. Why is Melissa King so terrified of military connections that she'd call cops on a veteran moving boxes?" His eyes narrow as he watches Melissa pacing frantically on her porch. What is she really hiding? The next morning, Carter came by off duty to share Amy's complete story. And honestly, I wasn't emotionally prepared for the gut-wrenching weight of it. We're sitting in our barely furnished living room, with moving boxes serving as makeshift furniture, and this seasoned police officer is getting completely choked up, talking about losing his wife 7 years ago in a war zone halfway around the world. Staff Sergeant Amy Carter was a communications specialist with the Army, killed instantly when their convoy hit a massive improvised explosive device during what should have been a routine patrol through Helmand Province on March 15, 2016. Rachel had crawled through active Taliban gunfire to reach wounded soldiers scattered around the blast crater, appearing like a ghost materializing through the smoke and absolute chaos. According to survivor testimonies from the 8 soldiers who eventually made it home alive. Carter's voice cracked when he described how Rachel held Amy for 43 agonizing minutes while they waited for medical evacuation, whispering prayers and talking about Amy's family back in Orange County, about her dreams of starting a foundation for military children, about how proud Carter would be of her dedication. Amy's final words were specifically about you, Carter told Rachel with tears streaming down his face. She said, "Tell that medic she's my guardian angel. She made dying feel peaceful instead of terrifying. I'm sitting here realizing I married someone who literally carried people through their worst moments while I was probably home playing video games and ordering takeout." But Carter wasn't just sharing deeply emotional memories, he was systematically building a criminal case using proper police investigative procedures. He'd spent the previous evening accessing legal law enforcement databases to research Melissa's background, and what he found completely explained her panicked response to military contractor boxes. Public marriage records revealed that Melissa was legitimately married to Army Sergeant Thomas King, who died of cancer in November 2019. The tragedy was real, the loss genuine, and her initial survivor benefits were completely legal and deserved. Here's where legitimate grief becomes a federal crime. Melissa remarried her ex-husband, David Wilson, in February 2020 and deliberately never reported the change to the Veterans Administration. Under federal law, remarriage voids survivor benefit eligibility unless the new spouse is also a qualifying veteran, which David definitely wasn't. She'd been collecting $1,800 monthly for exactly 48 months while legally married to someone else. That's $86,400 in knowing, premeditated federal fraud that could send her to prison for years. But wait, it gets worse. Carter showed me his research notes, all obtained through completely legal police channels. Melissa had been using her HOA president position to investigate new residents through housing applications, specifically identifying military families, then systematically targeting them with harassment campaigns designed to drive them away before they could settle in and potentially notice inconsistencies in her Military Widow Act. The Williams family in 2021, Army backgrounds, harassed until they sold their house. The Smith family in 2022, Navy connections, driven away through impossible violations. The Johnson family in 2023, Marine heritage, forced to relocate after mysterious code infractions. This wasn't random neighbor cruelty or typical HOA power trips. This was calculated predatory behavior designed to protect ongoing criminal activity. Melissa was eliminating potential witnesses who might have federal connections necessary to expose benefit fraud. She'd turned community leadership into organized crime, and somehow nobody had connected the dots until Rachel's contractor boxes triggered her panic response. The woman had been running a systematic operation to destroy military families, and we'd just accidentally walked into her crosshairs. Frank, our retired Navy neighbor, approached us during Carter's explanation with his own disturbing observations. Something about Melissa's military stories never felt right, he told us quietly. Military spouses talk about deployments and service in specific ways. Her references always sounded fake, like someone reading from a script. Frank had been keeping informal notes about Melissa's inconsistent claim stories about Thomas's combat deployments that didn't match actual unit deployments, references to military culture that no real spouse would get wrong, lies about awards and commendations that didn't exist in official records. Carter revealed the most chilling aspect of Melissa's systematic targeting. She waited until military families were emotionally vulnerable, then struck with maximum damage. New arrivals during stressful moving periods, families dealing with active deployments overseas, veterans struggling with reintegration or PTSD treatment. She studied their weak points like a predator studying prey, then used HOA authority to attack when they were least capable of fighting back effectively. The psychological warfare was deliberate and calculated. Rachel listened to all this with growing determination. She'd spent 7 years building a peaceful civilian life, trying to forget combat trauma and war memories, and this neighborhood dictator had dragged her back into conflict. But I could see something changing in her expression, something I'd never witnessed before. Cold analytical focus, military precision thinking. Melissa had accidentally awakened skills that had been dormant since Rachel's honorable discharge, and that was going to be a serious problem for someone running criminal schemes. The irony was incredible when you thought about it. Melissa thought she was protecting her fraud by targeting military families, but she'd just declared war on someone who understood tactical planning, strategic thinking, and systematic problem-solving under extreme pressure. Rachel started asking Carter detailed questions about HOA financial procedures, public record accessibility, and federal investigation protocols. She wasn't planning emotional revenge, she was planning a methodical investigation. When a former combat medic with active security clearance decides to investigate criminal activity, that criminal should start considering plea bargains. Carter shared information that made my blood pressure spike. His neighbor's interviews revealed Melissa's targeting wasn't just systematic, it was sadistic. She specifically waited for deployment stress, family emergencies, or financial difficulties, then hit families with expensive violations during their most vulnerable periods. The Williams family got hit with $2,000 in bogus fines right after their son deployed to Syria. The Smith family faced constant harassment while dealing with their daughter's severe PTSD treatment. This wasn't just fraud, it was psychological torture designed to break people who'd already sacrificed everything. During this conversation, I started understanding why Rachel had earned the Ghost Viper nickname in Afghanistan. It wasn't just because she moved quietly through combat zones, it was because she struck precisely when and where enemies least expected. She saved 23 lives by appearing exactly when soldiers needed her most, then vanishing back into the chaos. Now she was studying Melissa with that same tactical focus, and honestly, it was terrifying to watch. My sweet computer-fixing wife was transforming into someone who could systematically destroy enemies, using skills most people couldn't even comprehend. Carter explained his next steps in the investigation process. He'd filed the official VA fraud report through proper law enforcement channels, which would trigger a comprehensive audit of Melissa's benefit claims, financial records, and marriage history. The federal bureaucracy moves slowly but thoroughly, he warned us. 6 to 8 weeks minimum before they contact her for mandatory interviews. But when they do contact her, she'll be facing potential felony charges that could put her in federal prison for decades. The community dynamic was already shifting as Carter's investigation became known among veteran families. Word spread quietly through military networks about Melissa's systematic targeting and Rachel's heroic background. Veteran neighbors started reaching out to offer support and share their own experiences with Melissa's harassment. The protective instincts of military families were kicking in, and Melissa was about to discover what happened when you targeted someone the veteran community considered sacred. Carter finishes filing his VA fraud report and looks at me with complete seriousness. I found marriage records showing Melissa remarried in 2020, but she's still collecting dead husband benefits. Here's what bothers me: if she's stealing from the VA, what else has she been stealing? He glances toward the HOA office building with suspicion. And more importantly, how many other military families has she systematically driven away to cover her criminal tracks? Those 6 weeks of waiting for the federal bureaucracy to process Carter's fraud report felt like the longest month and a half of my entire existence on this planet. You know that anxious feeling when you're waiting for medical test results or job interview callbacks? This was exactly like that nightmare, except instead of waiting to hear about college admission or health concerns, we were sitting around wondering if our neighbor was going to federal prison for systematically stealing from military families. The tension was absolutely suffocating, and watching Melissa try to maintain her normal community leadership routine while knowing federal investigators were building a comprehensive criminal case against her was like watching someone try to act casual while their house actively burns down behind them. Rachel handled the mounting psychological stress with typical military discipline and precision, but I could definitely see the toll this situation was taking on her daily mental health and emotional stability. She'd wake up at exactly 5 in the morning to check for new violation notices that Melissa inevitably left under our door during overnight stealth missions, like some kind of suburban terrorist. She'd meticulously document every single interaction with Melissa, every harassment incident, every suspicious behavior or contradictory statement she witnessed or experienced. Her dining room table gradually transformed into a military-style command center with organized folders containing evidence, printed investigation timelines cross-referenced with public records, and legal documents arranged with the obsessive precision that probably saved soldiers' lives during her Afghanistan deployment. Meanwhile, I was dealing with this situation like any normal civilian would, stress-eating cereal at 2 in the morning and Googling things like, what happens when your neighbor commits federal crimes, and how long do people go to prison for benefit fraud? The learning curve was incredibly steep for someone whose biggest previous legal drama involved a parking ticket I forgot to pay. Now I'm researching federal sentencing guidelines and wondering if our property values are going to tank when this hits the local news. Melissa's harassment campaign during this federal investigation period was absolutely relentless in its calculated pettiness and psychological cruelty. Our mailbox was allegedly improperly positioned, according to Community Guidelines Section 12, Subsection 4, Paragraph 7. Our trash containers were supposedly placed 14 inches beyond acceptable boundary limits on weekly pickup day. Our outdoor light fixture suddenly became non-compliant with architectural standards, despite being completely identical to every other house on the entire block. Each violation notice came with substantial fines ranging from $50 to $500, and each citation referenced increasingly obscure HOA regulations that apparently nobody else in the neighborhood knew existed or had ever been required to follow. But here's what Melissa didn't realize during her desperate harassment campaign. Carter had been conducting his own comprehensive investigation using proper police procedure and systematic community outreach. He'd been strategically talking to neighbors during his regular patrol rounds, asking carefully casual questions about their experiences with HOA leadership, community management policies, and any unusual incidents they'd witnessed over the past several years. The picture that gradually emerged from these conversations was absolutely disturbing in its scope and implications. Carter's patient investigation revealed that Melissa's targeting wasn't random harassment based on personal grudges or typical HOA power trips. She'd been specifically and systematically identifying military families through background research, then destroying them through calculated harassment designed to force relocation before they could settle into the community long enough to notice inconsistencies in her fraudulent military widow performance. The precision was surgical, the cruelty deliberate, and the criminal intent undeniable. The crucial breakthrough evidence came when Mrs. Thompson, our 72-year-old neighbor with an elephant's memory for community gossip and neighborhood events, mentioned something she'd never considered important before Carter's investigation. At a community barbecue in September 2020, she'd clearly overheard Melissa complaining loudly about her absolutely impossible ex-husband David and the incredibly messy divorce proceedings that were severely complicating her financial situation and future planning. 6 months later, Melissa was publicly claiming to be a grieving military widow whose husband had died heroically overseas in service to their country. The timeline contradiction was glaring, and Mrs. Thompson's precise recollection provided crucial testimonial evidence proving Melissa's fraud was deliberate deception, not innocent oversight or bureaucratic confusion. Carter's legal database searches confirmed Mrs. Thompson's memory with documentary precision. Public marriage records showed that Melissa King divorced David Wilson in August 2019, married Thomas King in October 2019, became a legitimate military widow when Thomas died of cancer in November 2019, and then remarkably quickly remarried David Wilson in February 2020. The speed and suspicious timing of her remarriage to her previous spouse, while simultaneously maintaining military widow benefit claims, demonstrated clear criminal intent to defraud the federal government while preserving her established lifestyle and financial security. During this investigation period, Rachel was conducting her own completely legal research using basic internet resources and public records searches that any motivated civilian could perform with patience and determination. She found David Wilson's social media profiles clearly showing his marriage to Melissa in 2020, complete with wedding photos and anniversary celebrations. She discovered Thomas King's legitimate military service records and death certificate through Freedom of Information Act requests. She compiled everything methodically, creating an airtight timeline that exposed Melissa's lies, fraud, and systematic targeting with documentary evidence that would hold up in federal court proceedings. The community slowly started turning against Melissa as evidence of her deception spread through normal neighborhood gossip and casual conversations over backyard fences. People began remembering specific details they'd previously ignored or dismissed as unimportant, like how Melissa never displayed any military honors from Thomas's supposed combat service, or how her deployment stories contained basic factual errors that any real military spouse would never make. Her references to military culture felt scripted and artificial to anyone with actual military family experience or a genuine connection to service members. Rachel started opening up to me about her military service during those tense weeks of waiting. She'd never talked much about Afghanistan before this situation, but now she shared stories about the soldiers she'd saved, the ones she couldn't save, and the crushing weight of carrying people's final moments. Ghost Viper wasn't just a cool nickname, she explained quietly. It represented the heaviest responsibility imaginable. I was the last friendly face dozens of soldiers saw before they died, and I carried that weight alone for 7 years after coming home. Melissa's response to growing community suspicion was to escalate her harassment campaign against us to increasingly desperate and obvious levels. She filed additional violation notices for infractions that bordered on official harassment and systematic targeting. Our welcome mat was inappropriately placed on our own front porch, according to some obscure regulation nobody had ever heard of. Our garden plants were non-compliant species, despite being identical to approved plants in other yards throughout the neighborhood. Our garage door was improperly maintained because it had a tiny scuff mark from completely normal use over time. She was clearly trying to build an extensive case that Rachel was a problematic resident who deserved community action and official intervention. But Melissa's increasingly desperate harassment backfired spectacularly when Carter's cybercrime contact investigated her claims about Rachel's alleged computer crimes and systematic hacking. The detective found absolutely no evidence of illegal hacking, no unauthorized access to private information, and no indication that Rachel had used anything beyond completely normal public records research and basic social media searches available to any citizen. Every piece of information about Melissa's criminal fraud came from legally accessible sources that any civilian could find using standard internet resources and basic research skills. The cybercrime detective hangs up and tells Carter, "No evidence of hacking, but here's the interesting part. Melissa King's been under VA fraud investigation for 6 weeks now." Carter's radio suddenly crackles with an urgent new call. As he answers, his face goes completely pale. "What do you mean federal agents are currently en route to Maple Street? What did the VA investigation just uncover? Drop a comment if you've ever seen someone's lies catch up to them this fast." The federal agents arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like the calm before a Category 5 hurricane making landfall. I was drinking coffee and desperately trying to pretend everything was normal when I spotted the unmarked government sedan pulling up directly to Melissa's house. Not our house, specifically hers. That's when I realized the VA fraud investigation had shifted into something much bigger and infinitely more serious than simple benefit verification paperwork. These weren't social workers coming to check documentation. These were federal investigators with badges, guns, and the legal authority to make people disappear into the criminal justice system for decades. Melissa must have been obsessively watching from her front window, like some kind of paranoid surveillance operator, because she answered the door before the agents could even knock or ring the doorbell. From our living room window, I could clearly see her gesturing frantically and talking rapidly in obvious panic mode, probably trying desperately to maintain her composure while her entire criminal empire crumbled around her in real time. The lead investigator was this absolutely no-nonsense woman in a dark suit who looked like she'd heard every possible excuse in the book and believed exactly none of them. She handed Melissa some official paperwork and started asking pointed questions that clearly weren't going in the direction Melissa had hoped, expected, or prepared for. Carter had warned us that this federal confrontation was inevitable, but actually witnessing it happen felt completely surreal and almost cinematic. They'll want to verify Thomas King's legitimate death certificate and confirm her current remarriage status with David Wilson, he'd explained to us the previous evening while reviewing his investigation notes. Standard operating procedure for all suspected benefit fraud cases involving marital status changes. What he hadn't mentioned was how absolutely thorough and relentless federal investigators become when they detect the distinctive scent of a much larger criminal conspiracy hiding beneath the surface. These agents weren't just checking one woman's individual benefit claim for simple remarriage oversight. They were systematically mapping an entire network of fraud that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And from the thickness of their file folders, they had already discovered way more criminal activity than any of us had imagined possible from one suburban HOA president. Rachel watched the federal interview process unfold from our kitchen window with this intensely focused expression that I'd never seen before in our 6 years of marriage. Not worried or anxious exactly, but laser-focused and analytically observant, like she was studying enemy troop movements or tactical positioning during combat operations. "They're not just asking standard questions about survivor benefit eligibility," she observed quietly while taking careful mental notes of the agent's behavior patterns. "Look at their body language and documentation process. They've discovered something much bigger and more extensive than simple remarriage fraud." And she was absolutely correct in her tactical assessment. The investigators kept referring to thick folders and making detailed notes about issues that clearly went far beyond simple benefit eligibility verification. They had charts, timelines, financial records, and what looked like surveillance photographs. This wasn't a routine audit. This was a comprehensive criminal investigation that had been building for months, possibly years. Later that same afternoon, Melissa hired expensive legal representation, and I mean seriously expensive. $8,000 up front for a federal criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime and government fraud cases, which tells you exactly how serious and potentially devastating this situation had become for her future freedom. The lawyer arrived in a luxury Mercedes and spent over 3 hours at Melissa's house, probably getting the complete story about her various criminal activities and calculating how many years in federal prison she was realistically facing based on current sentencing guidelines. When the lawyer finally left, his grim facial expression and defeated body language suggested the legal news wasn't remotely positive for his new client. He looked like someone who'd just been asked to defend the Titanic against iceberg-related lawsuits. Not a good sign for Melissa's prospects of avoiding serious prison time. The community gossip network went into absolute overdrive during this dramatic period. Mrs. Thompson saw the federal agents and immediately started asking pointed questions about the nature of their official visit. Mr. Roberts noticed the expensive criminal defense lawyer and began sharing his accumulated observations about Melissa's increasingly inconsistent stories over the past several years. Even our postal worker mentioned that Melissa's mail delivery had been flagged for federal investigation monitoring, meaning her correspondence was being tracked and potentially intercepted. Suddenly, everyone was remembering specific details they had previously ignored or dismissed as unimportant neighborhood gossip. People started recalling how Melissa frequently claimed Thomas had earned a Purple Heart for combat injuries, but never displayed any actual military honors during community events or patriotic celebrations. Her stories about his deployment experiences contained basic factual errors that any real military spouse would never make. She couldn't correctly identify his unit, got deployment dates wrong, and described military procedures that didn't exist. Rachel spent that entire week compiling additional evidence using completely legal and publicly accessible research methods. She submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for public records, documented every harassment violation notice we'd received with timestamps and photographic evidence, and created a comprehensive timeline of Melissa's systematic targeting campaign against our family specifically. No hacking, no illegal surveillance, no privacy violations, just methodical documentation and research that any motivated civilian could accomplish using standard internet resources and public record databases available to all citizens. The VA investigator contacted Melissa for her mandatory in-person interview, and apparently the meeting didn't go very well for her criminal defense strategy or future prospects. Carter heard through official law enforcement channels that Melissa couldn't provide adequate documentation to support her continued benefit claims under serious federal scrutiny. She had Thomas King's legitimate death certificate from the cancer that killed him in 2019, but when directly questioned about her current remarriage status and legal obligations to report significant life changes, she claimed she simply forgot to notify the appropriate federal agencies about her change in marital circumstances. Federal investigators don't accept "I forgot" as a legally valid defense for $86,400 in deliberately fraudulent benefit claims over multiple years of systematic deception. The evidence clearly showed intentional concealment and deliberate criminal behavior, not accidental oversight or bureaucratic confusion. Melissa had filed joint tax returns with David Wilson while simultaneously claiming single military widow status for VA benefit purposes. She had deliberately used her maiden name for some official documents and her first married name for others, clearly attempting to create confusion and hide the paper trail connecting her multiple legal identities and fraudulent financial claims. The investigation's scope expanded far beyond simple benefit fraud when federal agents discovered Melissa's HOA financial irregularities during their standard background verification process. Apparently, when federal investigators start examining someone's complete financial picture for fraud prosecution purposes, they examine absolutely everything with microscopic attention to detail and forensic accounting precision. They discovered inflated contractor payment schemes, questionable memorial fund expenditures that never resulted in actual community improvements, and violation of fine collections that mysteriously didn't match official HOA budget reports or community account statements maintained by the treasurer. Carter shared some of these preliminary discoveries with us because we were officially classified as witnesses to Melissa's harassment campaign and systematic targeting behavior. She's been operating multiple simultaneous fraud schemes for years, he explained, with obvious disgust and professional outrage. The survivor benefit theft was just one steady income stream. She's also been systematically skimming HOA community funds, deliberately overcharging residents for maintenance projects that were never completed, and personally pocketing violation fines that should legally go toward neighborhood improvements and community services. Melissa's lawyer hangs up and turns to her with the worst possible news. The VA found your remarriage certificate, Melissa, but that's not the real problem. He pauses, studying the federal warrant in his hands. They're not just charging you with benefit fraud. There's something about mail fraud and conspiracy charges. What exactly have you been doing with that HOA president position? What other crimes is Melissa hiding? The conspiracy charges revealed absolutely everything. And honestly, the scope was way bigger than any of us had imagined in our worst nightmares. Melissa hadn't been working alone in her criminal enterprise. She'd been actively coordinating with other HOA presidents across 3 different counties to share targeting strategies, fraud techniques, and methods for systematically exploiting community leadership positions for personal profit. The federal investigation had uncovered an entire network of suburban dictators who'd been running organized crime operations disguised as homeowners association governance, specifically targeting military families and other vulnerable populations who might have federal connections capable of exposing their various illegal schemes and criminal activities. When Melissa's expensive criminal defense lawyer delivered that devastating news about federal conspiracy charges and potential decades in prison, she made the absolutely worst possible decision for her future freedom. Completely reject the government's plea bargain offer and fight all charges publicly through community support and character witness testimony. Her reasoning was typical narcissist logic, wrapped in complete delusional thinking. She'd convinced herself that her carefully established community standing and meticulously crafted patriotic reputation would somehow magically protect her from serious federal consequences and criminal prosecution. She demanded an emergency HOA meeting to completely clear her name and expose the coordinated conspiracy against innocent civilians. Poor Melissa had absolutely no idea that her planned public defense would actually become her very public execution and total social annihilation. The emergency community meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, and word spread through our neighborhood like wildfire through dry California grass during fire season. This wasn't just another boring HOA discussion about landscaping regulations or parking enforcement policies. This was going to be an epic showdown between a federal fraud suspect and the military families she'd been systematically targeting and destroying for years. 26 neighbors showed up, which was an absolute record for our usually completely apathetic community participation in local governance. The tension in that community center was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw and twice as dangerous. Melissa arrived dressed like she was attending a major political rally or presidential campaign event, complete with a "Support Our Troops" pin that would have been absolutely hilarious if it weren't so offensively ironic considering her extensive federal crimes against military families. She had prepared an elaborate presentation about outside agitators and false accusations from dangerous individuals with suspicious government connections, specifically designed to paint herself as the innocent victim of a coordinated attack by criminals who were threatening community safety and neighborhood security. Her manipulation strategy was classic psychological warfare, redirecting attention away from her own extensive crimes by creating a bigger, scarier enemy for the community to fear and rally against. She launched her desperate presentation by directly and viciously attacking Rachel's character, military background, and current civilian status. "We have a genuinely dangerous individual living in our peaceful community," Melissa announced dramatically to the assembled neighbors, with theatrical emotion, "someone with suspicious and potentially illegal military connections who's been systematically accessing private information through sophisticated computer crimes and government database hacking." She displayed printed screenshots of completely public records about her own remarriage to David Wilson, falsely claiming they proved Rachel had illegally hacked her personal data and violated federal privacy laws. The sheer audacity was absolutely breathtaking. She was using documentary evidence of her own federal crimes as supposed proof that someone else was the actual criminal mastermind. But Carter was completely ready for her desperate manipulation tactics and psychological warfare. He stood up calmly with his official police documentation and methodically destroyed every single accusation she'd made against Rachel's character and military service. He patiently explained how public records databases function for civilian access, how completely legal information searches work through proper channels, and how federal fraud investigations operate according to established government procedures and constitutional protections. Then he told the entire room about Amy Carter's heroic death and Rachel's distinguished military service as Ghost Viper, the legendary combat medic who had saved 23 soldiers' lives in Afghanistan through extraordinary courage under intense enemy fire. The emotional weight and sacred significance of Carter's testimony about his wife's death and Rachel's heroism immediately shifted the entire room's energy and community loyalty away from Melissa's manipulation attempts. You could feel the change in atmosphere as people realized they were hearing about real sacrifice, real heroism, and real loss. Not Melissa's fabricated victim narrative, designed to cover extensive criminal behavior. Frank presented his accumulated documentation of Melissa's systematic targeting pattern against military families over multiple years of calculated harassment. Photographs of bogus violation notices, detailed harassment timeline charts, and financial records clearly showing how veteran families had been systematically driven away from the neighborhood through impossible compliance demands and escalating penalty structures designed to cause maximum financial and emotional damage. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming in its scope and detail, but what really destroyed Melissa's credibility completely was the emotional testimony from actual families who'd been forced to abandon their homes because of her calculated campaigns. Mrs. Williams called in remotely from her new home in San Diego to describe in painful detail how Melissa had deliberately hit their family with over $2,000 in bogus violations immediately after their son deployed to Syria for active combat duty overseas. She specifically waited until we were emotionally vulnerable and financially stressed from deployment preparation, Mrs. Williams explained over the speakerphone system with obvious pain in her voice. She knew we couldn't effectively fight back while dealing with deployment anxiety, family separation trauma, and the constant fear of losing our child in combat. The calculated predatory cruelty was absolutely stunning to witness. And watching Melissa attempt to maintain her innocent victim act while this devastating testimony played was like watching someone slowly sink into quicksand. That's when Melissa's desperation reached absolute peak levels and her carefully maintained mask completely slipped off for everyone to see. She abandoned her prepared presentation materials entirely and started frantically attacking everyone in the room with increasingly unhinged accusations and paranoid theories. She accused Carter of coordinating a dangerous military conspiracy against innocent civilians and law-abiding community members. She claimed Rachel was using stolen veteran status to commit federal crimes against honest people. She demanded that the neighborhood protect itself immediately from dangerous outside military influences that threaten community safety and family security. The woman completely melted down in front of 26 witnesses, revealing the paranoid, predatory personality she'd been carefully hiding behind her community leader facade for years. Her final desperate gambit was playing the professional victim card with over-the-top theatrical emotion and crocodile tears. "I lost my beloved husband Thomas to military service overseas," she sobbed dramatically, with fake tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "I've devoted my entire adult life to supporting and protecting this wonderful community and its families, and now I'm being viciously attacked and slandered by the very same people I've tried so hard to help, support, and serve." But her manipulative performance fell completely flat because literally everyone in that room had either personally experienced her systematic harassment campaigns or witnessed them happening to innocent neighbors over multiple years of targeted abuse. The community response was swift, brutal, and absolutely final in its rejection of her leadership. HOA board members publicly resigned immediately rather than continue serving alongside someone under federal criminal investigation for systematic fraud and abuse of authority. Neighbors who'd remained neutral throughout the escalating conflict started sharing their own negative experiences with Melissa's authoritarian leadership style, financial mismanagement, and suspicious behavior patterns. The wall of community support she'd counted on for protection and character witness testimony crumbled in real time as people realized they'd been unknowing enablers of systematic abuse, fraud, and deliberate targeting of vulnerable military families who deserved community support, not persecution. As Melissa finishes her desperate speech to the neighbors, federal agents walk through the community center doors with official badges and arrest warrants. The lead agent looks directly at her and says, "Melissa King?" She nods hopefully, thinking they're finally here to arrest Rachel for imaginary crimes. "You're under arrest for federal benefit fraud." But as the handcuffs click around her wrists, the agent adds something that makes everyone in the room gasp audibly. "And we'll be investigating your co-conspirators throughout the region." Who else was involved in Melissa's extensive criminal scheme? The arrest happened in front of 26 neighbors, And let me tell you, watching a federal takedown in a suburban community center is something you never forget for the rest of your natural life. Melissa's face went through every single stage of grief in approximately 30 seconds: flat complete denial, explosive anger, desperate bargaining, crushing depression, and finally, this hollow, empty acceptance that her life as she knew it was permanently and irreversibly over. The federal agent read her Miranda rights, while neighbors instinctively pulled out their phones to record everything happening in real time. And suddenly, our quiet suburban drama had transformed into a viral moment of justice being served with brutal efficiency. The formal charges read aloud in front of everyone were extensive and absolutely devastating in their scope: survivor benefit fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit federal fraud across state lines, filing false federal reports, and something called abuse of fiduciary duty, specifically related to her systematic misuse of HOA authority for personal criminal gain and community exploitation. $86,400 in stolen survivor benefits was apparently just the tip of a much larger criminal iceberg that federal investigators had been mapping for months. The investigation uncovered an organized network of HOA presidents across 3 counties who'd been sharing detailed strategies for exploiting their community leadership positions while systematically targeting vulnerable residents who might potentially expose their various illegal schemes and fraudulent operations. Melissa's public breakdown was simultaneously spectacular and genuinely painful to witness as a fellow human being, even knowing what she'd done to innocent families. She cycled rapidly through denying everything completely, blaming everyone else in the room for her situation, then finally admitting her crimes while desperately claiming they were somehow justified by personal circumstances and financial desperation. "I absolutely needed that money to survive," she screamed hysterically as the handcuffs locked around her wrists in front of the entire community. "My entire life fell completely apart after Thomas died from cancer. Military wives get automatic support systems and community assistance. But what about civilian widows who remarry? Where's our help and government assistance when we need it most?" The sense of entitlement was absolutely staggering. She was attempting to frame systematic federal fraud as some kind of social justice activism or righteous civil disobedience. But what really sealed her fate permanently and destroyed any remaining sympathy was her vicious, unhinged attack on Rachel during the actual arrest process itself. "Ghost Viper is the real criminal here," she yelled frantically from the back of the patrol car while struggling against her restraints. "She systematically orchestrated all of this persecution. She's a dangerous military operative using her federal connections to destroy innocent civilians and law-abiding community members." The federal agent looked at Rachel with professional interest and respect, then back at Melissa with obvious contempt and complete disgust. "Ma'am, we've conducted an extremely thorough investigation of Miss Sanders over multiple months. She's a decorated combat veteran with an exemplary military record and absolutely spotless civilian background. You're the only criminal involved in this entire situation." The immediate community response was swift, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating for Melissa's remaining social connections and reputation. Neighbors who had actively supported her authoritarian leadership style for years publicly distanced themselves from her criminal behavior and systematic abuse of authority. The HOA board voted unanimously for her immediate removal from all positions and demanded a comprehensive financial audit of all community accounts that had been under her management authority for the past 4 years. Local media outlets picked up the story because federal arrests in affluent Orange County suburbs are genuinely newsworthy, especially when they involve military benefit fraud and systematic community corruption, specifically targeting veteran families and their children. Rachel handled her sudden transformation into a community hero with the same quiet dignity and grace she'd shown throughout this entire ordeal from beginning to end. When neighbors thanked her emotionally for exposing Melissa's systematic crimes against military families, she consistently redirected credit to Carter's professional investigation and the proper legal process, working as intended. When people asked detailed questions about her military service and combat experience in Afghanistan, she respectfully deflected attention toward honoring Amy Carter's memory and supporting other veteran families in the community who deserved recognition. She didn't want to be seen as some kind of warrior hero seeking attention. She just wanted Melissa's victims to receive appropriate justice and fair compensation for their suffering. The comprehensive audit of HOA accounts revealed fraud that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Melissa systematically inflated maintenance contracts with cooperating vendors who kicked back inflated payments, collected violation fines that never appeared in official reports, and skimmed money from neighborhood projects for personal luxuries. The pool renovation presented as costing $15,000. It had actually cost $8,000, with $7,000 funneled into Melissa's bank accounts for vacations and home improvements. Carter's expanded investigation uncovered even more disturbing evidence. Emails showed Melissa and other HOA presidents discussing problem residents and trading detailed tactics for driving them out through harassment, intimidation, and impossible compliance demands. The scheme went beyond benefit fraud. It was organized abuse of community leadership for profit, power, and protection of criminal enterprises. These women had turned suburban governance into a cover for organized crime. The most damning evidence came from Melissa's own obsessive record-keeping. Federal investigators seized her computers and found files on every military family in the neighborhood. These included background research, financial vulnerability assessments, deployment schedule tracking, and harassment strategies tailored to each family's weaknesses. She timed violations to deployments and crises, maximizing psychological damage and financial pressure. David Wilson, Melissa's husband and unwitting accomplice, immediately cooperated with investigators to avoid charges. He testified that Melissa had hidden fraudulent survivor benefit income throughout their marriage, keeping separate accounts and lying about her finances. "I believe she had savings from Thomas's military life insurance," he said under oath. "I never knew she was still illegally receiving payments while married to me." His cooperation provided the final proof of deliberate intent rather than mistake. A psychological evaluation ordered by her defense revealed disturbing patterns of narcissism, systematic targeting, and complete lack of empathy. The court-appointed psychologist concluded Melissa deliberately sought vulnerable populations for exploitation, using her leadership role to identify and destroy anyone threatening her fraud. Her downfall exposed not only financial crimes, but a chilling pattern of psychological cruelty, proving her HOA reign was never about community. It was about calculated exploitation of those least able to fight back. As Melissa sits in federal detention awaiting trial, her expensive lawyer delivers even more devastating news that destroys her remaining hope. The investigation found clear evidence of your systematic targeting strategy, specifically focused on military families and veteran residents. The federal prosecutor is pursuing hate crime enhancements because you deliberately selected victims based on their protected veteran status and military service. Her face goes completely ashen as she realizes the federal government doesn't just see her as a common fraudster. They see her as someone who committed calculated crimes against a legally protected class of citizens. How much worse can this possibly get? Comment if you think there were other corrupt HOA officials involved. 6 months later, the federal courthouse downtown became the stage for Melissa's final act. I had never been inside a federal building before this nightmare, and the marble halls, stone-faced marshals, and sheer weight of the place made me realize this was no longer neighborhood drama. This was real criminal justice, with consequences that would follow Melissa for the rest of her life. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, veteran families, and media covering what Orange County had already named the suburban HOA fraud scandal. The prosecutor's case was methodical and devastating. Melissa was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison with no possibility of parole, $108,000 in restitution, $47,000 in penalties and legal fees, and 5 years of supervised probation. But the financial punishment was minor compared to her social destruction. Her adult children publicly disowned her before the trial. Her son's viral post declared, "Melissa King's criminal actions don't represent our family's values. We're ashamed and want no association with someone who stole from military families." Her daughter changed her last name and moved across the country. Her grandchildren were forbidden from any contact. The judge added a hate crime enhancement for targeting military families. "Mrs. King, you identified and harassed families based on their service, exploiting sacrifices made for your freedom," he said. "This court finds your actions particularly reprehensible." Rachel testified as a victim impact witness, recounting Amy Carter's death in Afghanistan and how civilian life was meant to be a refuge from trauma. "Melissa King turned that refuge into a battlefield," she said. The courtroom fell silent. Melissa's lawyer had no defense against a decorated combat veteran's words. The ripple effects spread far beyond her case. Federal investigations into HOA fraud led to arrests in 3 other counties. Melissa's co-conspirators, HOA presidents, who shared targeting strategies, faced charges for a conspiracy that had run for 6 years. David Wilson divorced her before sentencing, testifying she had hidden fraudulent income throughout their marriage. I thought it was savings from Thomas's life insurance. I never knew she was stealing government benefits. His cooperation limited his liability to $15,000. Melissa's house went into foreclosure because she couldn't make payments without fraudulent income. The sale barely covered legal fees and initial restitution. She moved from a 4-bedroom suburban home to a studio apartment in a rough area, trading community influence for federal supervision and minimum wage prospects with a permanent felony record. Prison was particularly harsh because federal facilities house military veterans and families who understood her crime's significance. Her cellmate was serving drug charges, but her brother had died in Afghanistan. When she learned about Melissa's targeting of military families, she requested immediate transfer, refusing to share space with someone who'd betrayed military sacrifice for profit. Employment opportunities were severely limited by her specific crimes against military families. Defense contractors couldn't hire someone with fraud convictions. Military-owned businesses refused her applications. She eventually found work as a grocery clerk, wearing a name tag, while customers sometimes recognized her from news coverage of the fraud scandal. The community healing process was remarkable to witness. The new HOA president implemented policies preventing future targeting and abuse. Rachel was elected to the board to protect military families and ensure financial transparency. Carter received a commendation and a detective promotion for his investigation excellence. The neighborhood became genuinely welcoming to veterans, establishing annual memorial events honoring Amy Carter and other fallen service members. Rachel accepted promotion to senior cybersecurity analyst, partially based on investigative skills she'd demonstrated during this situation. Ghost Viper had found a new mission, protecting people through legitimate means that honored her military training and service experience without requiring return to combat zones or traumatic situations. Prison had destroyed Melissa's physical and mental condition completely. The woman who had once ruled our neighborhood was wearing orange jumpsuits and cleaning toilets for 23 cents hourly to pay restitution. Her cellmates knew exactly what she'd done, and federal prison has its own justice system. She'd requested protective custody twice after incidents with inmates who had military family connections and took her crimes personally. The final documentation of Melissa's complete defeat came through a letter she'd written to her estranged son from prison, a desperate plea for forgiveness that would never receive a response. "I destroyed my life trying to steal honor and respect I never earned," she wrote in shaky handwriting. "Ghost Viper didn't defeat me. My greed and lies defeated me. I should have welcomed them to the neighborhood instead of declaring war on people who deserved community support." Rachel spoke at the Amy Carter Memorial dedication ceremony that the community organized to honor military sacrifice and healing. "Amy would want us to forgive, but never forget the cost of freedom," she said, while Melissa performed court-ordered community service cleaning the memorial park. The irony was perfect. The woman who dishonored military families was forced to maintain a memorial honoring their sacrifice as part of her legal punishment. The neighborhood transformation was complete. Military families felt safe and welcome. Veteran support programs operated with proper oversight and genuine community backing. Rachel and Carter had become close friends, bonded by their shared connection to Amy's memory and commitment to protecting military families from future exploitation and targeting. As I finish reading Melissa's prison letter, Rachel walks in with an expression that suggests our ordeal might not be completely over. "Austin, I just got a call from someone in San Diego. They had an HOA president using the exact same military widow scam, targeting veterans with identical harassment techniques. They want to know if Ghost Viper would help expose their fraud, too." I stare at her in amazement. Is Melissa's scheme part of something much larger than we imagined? That's a story for another day. Thanks for joining us here at Echo Stories. If this wild ride of suburban justice hit the spot, smash that like button. I'm Austin, and I'll catch you in the next video where we dive into even crazier neighbor drama. Until then, keep your eyes open. You never know what your HOA president might be hiding.